because we didn't understand the kingdom theology enough and understand our purpose and what we're called to be in this world. Because we didn't understand that enough, we listened. Isn't it funny? We listen to the secular world tell us what Christianity really is. Like that's so bonkers to me. All right, so we've been discussing back and forth about what does it mean to be a Christian, what does it mean to be a conservative or a Republican, and what does it mean to be a liberal or a Democrat, and why we need to define our terms, but also this idea of unity, because we hear a lot of people talking about, well, we just need to unify and we just need to come together and we just need to move forward together, because Christians should be all about unity and we should be all about peace. And we do agree with that to an extent. Like, we should try to find unity. I won't say the word common ground, because I think common ground is a dangerous term to use. I don't believe there is common ground for where we are at this point. But we should be trying to seek out peaceful ends, right? We shouldn't be the type of people that are quickly become aggressive. But at the same time, we have to step back as well and go, okay, so what are they asking us to unify under? Like, what is the banner that we're being asked to unify under? Because it can't be that freedom is sacrificed at the altar of unity and peace, right? It can't be unity at all cost or peace at all cost. That is not the gospel. That is not the command in Genesis. That is not what we see. And so a lot of people might ask, well, why do you guys, as a Christian, as Kingdom Come, always talk a lot about politically? And we can obviously tell that you're conservative in your worldview. So why do you call it Kingdom Come? Why don't you just, call it some political show? To which we would respond, everything is God's world and in God's world, and everything is to be brought underneath God's kingdom. And that if we operate inside of God's kingdom, that is for the joy of mankind. And when we start to operate outside of the way that God's kingdom was originally designed and the way that we were originally designed to operate in it as royal representatives, that as you start to operate outside of that, it starts to fall apart. And that's always been true for all of human history. And so we believe that the conservative worldview, which has other terms beneath it that define it, just like the liberal worldview has other terms underneath that define it. And then obviously you have these main characteristics that define it, and then they break off from there. Because I wouldn't say that I'm a Mitt Romney conservative or a Paul Ryan conservative, right? So it's not completely blue and red. We want to make that clear too. That's not where we're at. But I think it's important to recognize there's certain things about the Democratic Party or the Democratic Party that it's become that as a Christian, you cannot unify under, because they just don't match up. What a Christian is defined as biblically, not as what maybe you've decided it is defined as, but what defines a biblical Christian, you can't find any common ground anymore with the Democratic Party, right? I mean, there's not any as a whole. And I think that's important to discuss to the viewers so that they understand why we don't believe that you can vote Democrat and be a Christian. Because on the surface, somebody might have pushback against that if that's as far as you take it. But when you start to get beneath those words and what makes up those words, what defines those words, that is where it becomes unable to be unified.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say, I don't guess either one of us would say that if you voted Democrat, you're not a Christian. I mean, you could take a shot with something like that and be critical, but is that decision to vote Democrat actually consistent with a Christian worldview? Or, if you're choosing that? Are you being inconsistent
Sure.
with your worldview?
Well, when I'm sinning, I'm being inconsistent with my worldview.
Right.
Right.
So voting Democrat is a sin.
Well, I'm just saying Christians can operate inconsistently with their worldview, as do most people.
Right.
Unless your worldview is just what makes you happy, which is a popular secular worldview these days. Do what makes you happy, and then you're so consistent until you're not. Till your happiness changes.
But I think even in defining some of these terms or just asking the question to help any person clarify their thinking, you could also ask, too, what does it mean to be an American? And what are the values that we uphold and in the ideals that are kind of ingrained in both our system and the Constitution and the things that shape it up, as well as how we've lived those out and carried them out through the generations.
And which party most reflects that?
Yeah, currently.
Right.
Not that it's always an easy conversation. I mean, you're going to get yourself in some awkward positions if you're just trying to define it simply as Republican or Democrat or conservative, liberal, just through the decades and generations. We know that it's kind of evolved and morphed over time.
Sure.
And so you can be aware of that, but at the same time, we are talking about right now.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of a unique time. And one of the things, as a Christian supporter of President Trump, what you often run into is how could you do that and be a Christian? Donald Trump is obviously not a Christian or acting as a Christian, so how can you put your support behind him as if, the two things are mutually exclusive and irreconcilable? Which, we've addressed that in the past, but what, seems to be missing in that kind of accusation is an awareness of the underlying, because it's not about the label. It's about the underlying values and principles and things that are priority for you. And ultimately just the things that you're valuing and your approach toward life. And if you look at the word conservative, that means to conserve or to kind of hang on to something from perhaps the past, or to not be eager to move away from the things that are our traditions and certain well-founded building blocks for society, being slow to change and considering that worthwhile and having that caution in your approach keeps us grounded in kind of the fundamentals.
Yeah, and even in our secular society of today, the evangelical church itself, the person that raises the question that you just said when they come and go, they're usually bringing this up from a secular person when they go, "How could you vote for Trump and be a Christian?" But I find that even they have looked through all the different kinds of Christianity that you can find in evangelical Christianity in America, and they found the one sect or the one group of Christians that they take that definition of the label to mean Christianity and they apply it to Trump, so that's what they're holding against you, right? It's like, look, according to this group of Christians and what they say Christianity is, you can't vote for Trump, right? Because that's what they say. And so they themselves have found the group that helps them ask the questions so that they can get the answer that they want, right? Instead of looking at biblical Christianity and trying to see, oh, wait, in biblical Christianity, there was a man named King Cyrus, and he was not a Christian, but he did a lot for the Jews, right? And so they're unable to see throughout the Bible that God, and we've talked about this before, that God is consistently using men that recognize, although they might not title it this way, they recognize the Imago Dei in people, and they recognize certain truths, although the terminology might be different in the way that they define it. It might not be defined biblically speaking, but they're recognizing the same realities that the Bible is acknowledging because that's how God created it, and they see that in people. And so they uphold these things, although their terminology might be different. They're still upholding these biblical realities because that is reality. The Bible is reality. So they're upholding these things. And God is using them to be a blessing unto the people, right? And you see King Cyrus, you see the judges, you see all of these kings in history that have all been a blessing or a curse. And it goes back to Genesis 12, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go all the way back there. But it goes back to that those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. And that reality of that covenant has always held true throughout human history, right? I mean, our success as Americans, I truly believe, is because we have been a blessing unto the nation of Israel, and therefore God has blessed us, right? I mean, that is a Genesis 12 covenant that we have upheld and that we've believed in for the most part, and we fought for, right? We fought for it. It's caused. I mean, it's taken some fights to be able to uphold that covenant, and so I think we as evangelicals, in a lot of ways, we have become a passive aggressive society overall, and we have allowed the world to use certain scriptures to try to condemn us when we get aggressive or when we say we're willing to fight. They try to condemn us, and like you said, they don't really care, right? It's not like they care about Christianity. They're just trying to find verses here and there that they can use and, make their own Christianity out of it and go, oh, look, you're so contradicting to what the Word says. And so it's caused us to back up and to turn the other cheek, right? As all these things have been happening, and our country has been taken over by wickedness and by evil. And we have sat back and allowed it to happen because we have turned the other cheek. Or if they take your cloak, give them 2, give them 3. I can just, whatever, right? I mean, so we've got out of the mindset of this kingdom theology, and we've got sucked in to defining Christianity by just certain passages rather than seeing the whole for what it is and what we've been called to be as believers and as image bearers. And I think that's fundamental in the way that we are able to see Trump and understand what's going on. And I think if we don't process these things right, that we're never going to get in the fight. And that before we know it, we're going to wake up one day and the fight's going to be over and freedom's going to be gone. And the church is going to be not non-existent, but it's going to be retreating back into its holes because they've lost their freedoms that they were unwilling to fight for. And we quit fighting for them because the world told us not to by taking certain scriptures, by cramming them in our throat, because we didn't understand the kingdom theology enough and understand our purpose and what we're called to be in this world. Because we didn't understand that enough, we listened. Isn't it funny? We listen to the secular world tell us what Christianity really is. Like that's so bonkers to me. And you see people doing it all the time. They literally allow the secular world to define Christianity for them. And I'm like, what?
What? And even some of our misconceptions that are just perpetuated through the ages in order to kind of go along, to get along more so, or to be more liked and accepted, and versus standing strong. Because as Christians, you make bold claims, and it has this exclusive nature. You're declaring truth, and making bold truth claims, and ultimately about the identity of Jesus. And he is the ruler of the world, and he's the true king that we all ought to fall in line under. And that is, one of the great and ultimate truths of the scripture that then defines so much else for us. But, in establishing the United States as a nation, and coming out of Europe, and dealing with the divine right of kings to rule, and being maybe averse to that in some way, and recognizing the need to make a distinction between church and state, and really establishing clear boundaries in the process in order to protect the church or any belief system from a state that might get out of control through too much power, and then try to suppress and the people and their freedom to worship how they choose. And so this notion of separation of church and state, whereas biblically there is no separation in that way. God rules over the world, and He is the king over His people, and we are in the world and called to operate in it for a purpose, but yet we're not of it. And so there's always this distinction throughout God's story of God's people who He rules over, and then the world and worldly systems and the kind of the systems that humans create, and the way that those rule over humanity versus the people who are ruled by God.
And the human system always ends up being
oppressive,
tyrannical, one king with multiple people that are friends to the king in some way, and it is truly a class battle in human systems, because that's what they're always after, because they recognize the need for the workers to supply the upper class. And
it's about who has the power, the position of power, and then they maintain that through force. And
because they don't recognize the imago Dei in their neighbor. They don't recognize that. They are more in line with, and we've done videos on this if you want to go back and look at it, they're more in line with pagan theology, right? In the days of Mesopotamia and Babylonia, Babylonian religions, when they believed that, you had the greater gods and the junior gods, and the junior gods created man to work for the junior gods so that they could rule, and that man would work, right? That is the human system, just replaying itself. It's very paganistic. This secular idea, all these so-called secular governors and secular people, they still operate out of paganism, because the one ruler that's behind it all doesn't care if it's secular or if it's pagan, because his name is Satan. He doesn't care which one you call it. If you see the mysticism in it or you see the secularism in it, it's the same ruler that's behind both of them. And they both look the same. They both are the same.
And they're attractive to men, especially humans that do have that lust for power and are driven by their self-interest, which we all have a problem with, but those who acquire that power and then rule over others, and then they go to whatever lengths they must to maintain it, but it is very humanistic. And though it gives the appearance of humans ascending to power and ruling over ourselves, but like you said, in the background, the true ruler of that system is no friend of humanity, but the enemy of humanity, who would use any means, most especially deception, to position himself authoritatively and deceiving humans to think that we're in power and control, and we're doing the things that are in our self-interest or collective interest to maintain that system, versus God's order that has God at the top always, but then, of course, humans created in His image and with utmost dignity and distinction in order to image God into the world. So we've been given and called with this high calling from God, but yet God is always meant to be the ruler. And then when He does, in the narrative of the Bible, rescue His people, call Abraham and rescue the Israelites out of Egypt, establish them as a nation, He's intended to be their king, and He has been merciful to them by delivering them out of slavery and being just lost in the world apart from God. And now He's establishing them as the true people of God, giving them a law and making them a nation that would be separate from the peoples around them. And they were always meant to be marked by being the people of God, because they had God's law and they had God's presence with them, and God was leading them into the land that He would give them and prosper them within. And as long as we would do that and live according to his ways, his guidance and instruction, things would go well for us. In contrast to everyone else in the rest of the world who are falling under that worldly system, and as a consequence are ruled over by corrupt men in one form or another, whether that's a tyrannical king or emperor or a corrupt government in our modern times. And so when we're looking out now into our current situation, and we're trying to define some categories in where we fall or where we intentionally position ourselves, I mean, the same kind of simple big categories are still relevant. They still apply. Who is our ruler? Who do we humble ourselves under to follow their rule and authority? Is it God or is it man?
Well,